and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I am joined by a special guest, Niall Stanage. This is the first time I think we've been co-hosting together.
It is. Good to see you.
It's really great to see you. It's been a real pleasure, I gotta say, to watch you do real journalism work at some of these press conferences. We're gonna get into some of the exchanges that you've had with Biden spokespeople later on today. But first, we're gonna get into a different story. A new CNN report details horrific conditions and abuse Gazan detainees have been enduring at the hand of the Israeli military. An Israeli who works at the desert at camp where Palestinians captured in Gaza are being held snapped two photos showing rows of blindfolded prisoners sitting on paper-thin mattresses, their heads down and their hands appearing to be cuffed. According to the whistleblower, the prisoners were not allowed to talk, to peek under the blindfold, and forced to sit upright. In total, 3 whistleblowers who work at the detention facility spoke up on the condition of anonymity. In a comment to CNN, Israeli Defense Forces said it, quote, ensures the IDF ensures proper conduct toward the detainees in custody. Any allegation of misconduct by IDF soldiers is examined and dealt with accordingly.
Now, according to the report, the IDF acknowledged turning 3 different military facilities into detention camps for Palestinian detainees from Gaza. That's since the Hamas-led October 7th attack. Israel's unlawful combatants law stipulates prisoners can be held for 45 days without a warrant, after which they are transferred to Israel's formal prison system. Currently, about 9,000 Palestinians are jailed and 18 have reportedly died in Israeli custody.
So this is a really bombshell story. It has not gone unnoticed, I think, by folks who have been sympathetic to the plight of Gazans, that a story of this magnitude, something that might be described as prison camps where people are being held outside of any kind of judicial process in conditions that may be demonstrated to violate international law, would be a huge story if the roles were reversed. If this was a story about the conditions under which Israeli prisoners, for example, had been kept. And this is something that has been reported on for quite some time. There was this more recent reporting, I think, is more mainstream coverage and attached to these whistleblower reports, which I think give it more substance and credibility. But this kind of behavior and this kind of treatment of Palestinian detainees certainly has been reported throughout this conflict. And before this conflict, with very little media attention, and despite this kind of bombshell reporting that we're talking about now, there's been a real silence on this among mainstream media sources outside of, I think, Democracy Now!
Yeah, there has, and I think there is a real reluctance to criticize Israel for this kind of behavior, not only because there's a reluctance in and of itself, but where does the logical conclusion of that argument lead to? And also, what is this kind of treatment based in? One of the quotes from the whistleblowers in that CNN report talks about ill treatment of detainees being about revenge rather than for getting information. And I think there is this issue, and there has been throughout the conflict, of a dehumanization of the Palestinian side of the equation. And, you know, we see that in a lot of the coverage, and particularly in the early days. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that people who suffered horrific loss on October 7th shouldn't have their stories told. Clearly they should do. But the kind of granular detail about the suffering of the Palestinians in various ways has been undercovered, in my opinion.
Yeah, and we saw that with the now Pulitzer-winning New York Times having the reporting done by The Intercept, which demonstrated that words like horrific or barbaric were used, I think one comparison was 60-1 when describing harms that had been done against Israelis versus harms against Palestinians. And that in fact, as the death toll in Gaza rose so disproportionately, those asymmetries remained when you would expect the opposite, that with more Palestinian death, you would see more of those terms being applied to the kind of experiences the Palestinians have been having.
Right, and that kind of terminology is a very sort of insidious way in which sort of biases can present themselves or existing prejudices can be reinforced. That doesn't have to be done in a really blatant headlining way.
Yeah.
It can be done with the adjectives you use to describe certain conditions or the verbs you use to describe certain actions. And I think that is something to be watchful for as far as media coverage is concerned.
Now, you've had an opportunity to question State Department spokesmembers about what the American response to these reports should be. And I'd love to get more of insight from you, since you've been able to ask these questions. You've been able to get a kind of up close personal view of how America is responding to these reports as they're coming out. If you see any indication that there is going to be a change in American foreign policy as a consequence of the stories that are coming out of Gaza?
Not hugely is the blunt answer, because I mean, maybe we can get into the State Department report that came out on a Friday night, which is traditionally when bad news or awkward news is buried.
Yeah.
But that was what I asked about yesterday, because it seems to me that in that State Department report, there are certain facts that are so obvious that you can't deny them, but that report reads to me as if you're trying, you being the United States government, trying to get out of the logical conclusions of where those facts lead. And so we have these rather bizarre situations where, for example, it is reasonable to assess that Israel has committed war crimes, but somehow not such that we would have to suspend aid from them. In relation to restrictions of humanitarian aid, the argument is, well, yes, they have done that, and they've done that through the conflict, but today we don't assess they're doing it in a way that contravenes this particular subsection of law. It's a very legalistic, at best, argument to try to avoid where things are leading.
Yeah, all right, well, stick around. We're going to come back to that. But meanwhile, as Israel presses forward toward Rafah, it has closed the Rafah border crossing into Egypt, preventing fuel, food, and water from entering Rafah for over a week, per the journalist Ryan Grimm, former host of the show. He took to Twitter writing, "Update, one of the American doctors trapped in Gaza by Israel's siege is Adam Hamaway, an Army veteran who famously saved the life of Senator Duckworth after her helicopter crash in Iraq." So this story, I think, is escalating again. In part one, you get CNN coverage, you get more mainstream media traction, but also you have, and again, Americans involved, not just any American, but an American who found some kind of fame and had a lot of domestic plaudits for being involved in saving the life of Tammy Duckworth. Still, it seems that this doesn't seem to be enough to change the trajectory of American foreign policy.
No, I don't think so. These stories break through to a degree, but not in such a way as really changes the policy, to your point, or creates a sea change in the body politic. Now, what we have seen, as you're well aware in polling, is an increasing number of Americans, well beyond the hard left, or whatever term you want to use, becoming condemnatory of Israel's policies and Israel's assault in Gaza. So it does change in that way. It is also worth pointing out, Brie, I think, that a lot of these things, they don't get massive coverage, but they get more coverage, frankly, than if there were a Arab-Palestinian doctor in this situation. The same thing with the World Central Kitchen tragedy. I mean, that was horrific and deserved all the coverage it got. There have, I think, according to Human Rights Watch, been at least 8 instances where Israel has attacked humanitarian workers or their buildings and killed, a number of people.
Yes, I did see that out today. So the UN has been saying now for months that this conflict has resulted in the largest number of UN staff members killed since the beginning of the UN. Though, as you point out, the Human Rights Watch has aggregated all of the instances of these humanitarian workers being arguably targeted in Gaza, and it makes it seem very difficult to frame the Jose Andres attack as a one-off, accidental, anomalous in any way. There are these 8 documented cases in which aid organizations or UN agencies shared their GPS coordinates with Israel, ostensibly so that they could be safe while they're doing humanitarian projects in Gaza, and found themselves attacked. These attacks have resulted in the deaths of 15 people, including 2 kids, and 16 other injuries, 16 others killed, rather. So this is a lot of news. We still have more updates on what's going on in the region coming up next, along with a lot of other things going on domestically. So do stick around. More Rising after this.